Hi, Dad. What are we going to talk about tonight?
Well, tonight, Michael, I thought I'd talk about reptiles and the early mammals and how our Earth evolved.
Cool. Like snakes, frogs, and lizards? Even dinosaurs?
Yeah, you got it.
Okay, let's get started.
Urantia during the early land life era. The era of exclusive marine life has ended. Land elevation, cooling crust and cooling oceans, sea restriction and consequent deepening, together with a great increase of land in northern latitudes, all conspired greatly to change the world's climate in all regions far removed from the equatorial zone. The closing epochs of the preceding era were indeed the age of frogs, but these ancestors of the land vertebrates were no longer dominant, having survived in greatly reduced numbers. Very few types outlived the rigorous trials of the preceding period of biologic tribulation. Even the spore-bearing plants were nearly extinct. 1. The early Reptilian Age. The erosion deposits of this period were mostly conglomerates, shale, and sandstone. The gypsum and red layers throughout these sedimentations over both America and Europe indicate that the climate of these continents was arid. These arid districts were subjected to great erosion from the violent and periodic cloudbursts on the surrounding highlands. Few fossils are to be found in these layers, but numerous sandstone footprints of the land reptiles may be observed. In many regions, the 1,000 feet of red sandstone deposit of this period contains no fossils. The life of land animals was continuous only in certain parts of Africa. These deposits vary in thickness from 3,000 to 10,000 feet, even being 18,000 on the Pacific coast. Lava was later forced in between many of these layers. The Palisades of the Hudson River were formed by the extrusion of basalt lava between these Triassic strata. Volcanic action was extensive in different parts of the world. Over Europe, especially Germany and Russia, may be found deposits of this period. In England, the new red sandstone belongs to this epoch. Limestone was laid down in the southern Alps as the result of a sea invasion, and may now be seen as the peculiar dolomite limestone walls, peaks, and pillars of those regions. This layer is to be found all over Africa and Australia. The Carrara marble comes from such modified limestone. Nothing of this period will be found in the southern regions of South America, as that part of the continent remained down, and hence presents only a water or marine deposit, continuous with the preceding and succeeding epochs. 150 million years ago, the early land life periods of the world's history began. Life, in general, did not fare well, but did better than at the strenuous and hostile close of the marine life era. As this era opens, the eastern and central parts of North America, the northern half of South America, most of Europe, and all of Asia are well above water. North America for the first time is geographically isolated, but not for long, as the Bering Strait land bridge soon again emerges, connecting the continent with Asia. Great troughs developed in North America, paralleling the Atlantic and Pacific coasts. The Great Eastern Connecticut Fault appeared, one side eventually sinking 2 miles. Many of these North American troughs were later filled with erosion deposits, as also were many of the basins of the fresh and saltwater lakes of the mountain regions. Later on, these filled land depressions were greatly elevated by lava flows which occurred underground. The petrified forests of many regions belong to this epoch. The Pacific coast, usually above water during the continental submergences, went down, excepting the southern part of California, and a large island which then existed in what is now the Pacific Ocean. This ancient California sea was rich in marine life, and extended eastward to connect with the old sea basin of the Midwestern region. 140 million years ago, suddenly, and with only the hint of the 2 pre-reptilian ancestors that developed in Africa during the preceding epoch, the reptiles appeared in full-fledged form. They developed rapidly, soon yielding crocodiles, scaled reptiles, and eventually both sea serpents and flying reptiles. Their transition ancestors speedily disappeared. These rapidly evolving reptilian dinosaurs soon became the monarchs of this age. They were egg-layers, and are distinguished from all animals by their small brains, having brains weighing less than 1 pound to control bodies later weighing as much as 40 tons. But earlier reptiles were smaller, carnivorous, and walked kangaroo-like on their hind legs. They had hollow avian bones, and subsequently developed only 3 toes on their hind feet, and many of their fossil footprints have been mistaken for those of giant birds. Later on, the herbivorous dinosaurs evolved. They walked on all fours, and one branch of this group developed a protective armor. Several million years later, the first mammals appeared. They were non-placental and proved a speedy failure. None survived. This was an experimental effort to improve mammalian types, but it did not succeed on Urantia. The marine life of this period was meager, but improved rapidly with the new invasion of the sea, which again produced extensive coastlines of shallow waters. Since there was more shallow water around Europe and Asia, the richest fossil beds are to be found about these continents. Today, if you would study the life of this age, examine the Himalayan, Siberian, and Mediterranean regions, as well as India and the islands of the southern Pacific basin. A prominent feature of the marine life was the presence of hosts of the beautiful ammonites, whose fossil remains are found all over the world. 130 million years ago, the seas had changed very little. Siberia and North America were connected by the Bering Strait land bridge. A rich and unique marine life appeared on the Californian Pacific coast, where over 1,000 species of ammonites developed from the higher types of cephalopods. The life changes of this period were indeed revolutionary, notwithstanding that they were transitional and gradual. This period extended over 25 million years and is known as the Triassic. The later Reptilian Age. 120 million years ago, a new phase of the Reptilian Age began. The great event of this period was the evolution and decline of the dinosaurs. Land animal life reached its greatest development in point of size, and had virtually perished from the face of the earth by the end of this age. The dinosaurs evolved in all sizes, from a species less than 2 feet long up to the huge non-carnivorous dinosaurs, 75 feet long, that have never since been equaled in bulk by any living creature. The largest of the dinosaurs originated in western North America. These monstrous reptiles are buried throughout the Rocky Mountain regions, along the whole of the Atlantic coast of North America, over western Europe, South Africa, and India, but not in Australia. These massive creatures became less active and strong as they grew larger and larger, but they required such an enormous amount of food, and the land was so overrun by them, that they literally starved to death and became extinct. They lacked the intelligence to cope with the situation. By this time, most of the eastern part of North America, which had long been elevated, had been leveled down and washed into the Atlantic Ocean, so that the coast extended several hundred miles farther out than now. The western part of the continent was still up, but even these regions were later invaded by both the Northern Sea and the Pacific, which extended eastward to the Dakota Black Hills region. This was a freshwater age, characterized by many inland lakes, as is shown by the abundant freshwater fossils of the so-called Morrison beds of Colorado, Montana, and Wyoming. The thickness of these combined salt and freshwater deposits varies from 2,000 to 5,000 feet, but very little limestone is present in these layers. The same polar sea that extended so far down over North America likewise covered all of South America, except the soon-appearing Andes Mountains. Most of China and Russia was inundated, but the water invasion was greatest in Europe. It was during this submergence that the beautiful lithographic stone of southern Germany was laid down, those strata in which fossils, such as the most delicate wings of olden insects, are preserved as of but yesterday. The flora of this age was much like that of the preceding. Ferns persisted, while conifers and pines became more and more like the present-day varieties. Some coal was still being formed along the northern Mediterranean shores. The return of the seas improved the weather. corals spread to European waters, testifying that the climate was still mild and even, but they never again appeared in the slowly cooling polar seas. The marine life of these times improved and developed greatly, especially in European waters. Both corals and crinoids temporarily appeared in larger numbers than heretofore, but the ammonites dominated the invertebrate life of the oceans, their average size ranging from 3 to 4 inches, though one species attained a diameter of 8 feet. Sponges were everywhere, and both cuttlefish and oysters continued to evolve. 110 million years ago, the potentials of marine life were continuing to unfold. The sea urchin was one of the outstanding mutations of this epoch. Crabs, lobsters, and the modern types of crustaceans matured. Marked changes occurred in the fish family, a sturgeon type first appearing, but the ferocious sea serpents, descended from the land reptiles, still infested all the seas, and they threatened the destruction of the entire fish family. This continued to be, preeminently, the age of the dinosaurs. They so overran the land that 2 species had taken to the water for sustenance during the preceding period of sea encroachment. These sea serpents represent a backward step in evolution. While some new species are progressing, certain strains remain stationary, and others gravitate backward, reverting to a former state. And this is what happened when these 2 types of reptiles forsook the land. As time passed, the sea serpents grew to such size that they became very sluggish, and eventually perished because they did not have brains large enough to afford protection for their immense bodies. Their brains weighed less than 2 ounces, notwithstanding the fact that these huge ichthyosaurs sometimes grew to be 50 feet long, the majority being over 35 feet in length. The marine crocodilians were also a reversion from the land type of reptile, but unlike the sea serpents, these animals always returned to the land to lay their eggs. Soon after 2 species of dinosaurs migrated to the water in a futile attempt at self-preservation, 2 other types were driven to the air by the bitter competition of life on land. But these flying pterosaurs were not the ancestors of the true birds of subsequent ages. They evolved from the hollow-boned leaping dinosaurs, and their wings were of bat-like formation, with a spread of 20 to 25 feet. These ancient flying reptiles grew to be 10 feet long, and they had separable jaws, much like those of modern snakes. For a time, these flying reptiles appeared to be a success, but they failed to evolve along lines which would enable them to survive as air navigators. They represent the non-surviving strains of bird ancestry. Turtles increased during this period, first appearing in North America. Their ancestors came over from Asia by way of the northern land bridge. 100 million years ago, the reptilian age was drawing to a close. The dinosaurs, for all their enormous mass, were all but brainless animals, lacking the intelligence to provide sufficient food to nourish such enormous bodies. And so did these sluggish land reptiles perish in ever-increasing numbers. Henceforth, evolution will follow the growth of brains, not physical bulk, and the development of brains will characterize each succeeding epoch of animal evolution and planetary progress. This period, embracing the height and the beginning decline of the reptiles, extended nearly 25 million years and is known as the Jurassic. The Cretaceous stage, the flowering plant period, the age of birds. The Great Cretaceous period derives its name from the predominance of the prolific chalk-making foraminifers in the seas. This period brings Urantia to near the end of the long reptilian dominance and witnesses the appearance of flowering plants and bird life on land. These are also the times of the termination of the westward and southward drift of the continents, accompanied by tremendous crustal deformations and concomitant widespread lava flows and great volcanic activities. Near the close of the preceding geologic period, much of the continental land was up above water, although as yet there were no mountain peaks. But as the continental land drift continued, it met with the first great obstruction on the deep floor of the Pacific. This contention of geologic forces gave impetus to the formation of the whole vast north and south mountain range extending from Alaska down through Mexico to Cape Horn. This period thus becomes the modern mountain-building stage of geologic history. Prior to this time, there were few mountain peaks, merely elevated land ridges of great width. Now the Pacific Coast Range was beginning to elevate, but it was located 700 miles west of the present shoreline. The Sierras were beginning to form, their gold-bearing quartz strata being the product of lava flows of this epoch. In the eastern part of North America, Atlantic sea pressure was also working to cause land elevation. 100 million years ago, the North American continent and a part of Europe were well above water. The warping of the American continents continued, resulting in the metamorphosing of the South American Andes and in the gradual elevation of the western plains of North America. Most of Mexico sank beneath the sea, and the southern Atlantic encroached on the eastern coast of South America, eventually reaching the present shoreline. The Atlantic and Indian Oceans were then about as they are today. 95 million years ago, the American and European land masses again began to sink. The southern seas commenced the invasion of North America, and gradually extended northward to connect with the Arctic Ocean, constituting the second greatest submergence of the continent. When this sea finally withdrew, it left the continent about as it now is. Before this great submergence began, the eastern Appalachian highlands had been almost completely worn down to the water's level. The many-colored layers of pure clay now used for the manufacture of earthenware were laid down over the Atlantic coast regions during this age, their average thickness being about 2,000 feet. Great volcanic actions occurred south of the Alps and along the line of the present California Coast Range mountains. The greatest crustal deformations in millions upon millions of years took place in Mexico. Great changes also occurred in Europe, Russia, Japan, and southern South America. The climate became increasingly diversified. 90 million years ago, the angiosperms emerged from these early Cretaceous seas and soon overran the continents. These land plants suddenly appeared along with fig trees, magnolias, and tulip trees. Soon after this time, fig trees, breadfruit trees, and palms overspread Europe and the western plains of North America. No new land animals appeared. 85 million years ago, Bering Strait closed, shutting off the cooling waters of the northern seas. Theretofore, the marine life of the Atlantic Gulf waters and that of the Pacific Ocean had differed greatly, owing to the temperature variations of these two bodies of water, which now became uniform. The deposits of chalk and green sand marl give name to this period. The sedimentations of these times are variegated, consisting of chalk, shale, sandstone, and small amounts of limestone, together with inferior coal or lignite, and in many regions they contain oil. These layers vary in thickness from 200 feet in some places to 10,000 feet in western North America and numerous European localities. Along the eastern borders of the Rocky Mountains, these deposits may be observed in the up-tilted foothills. All over the world, these strata are permeated with chalk, and these layers of porous, semi-rock pick up water at upturned outcrops and convey it downward to furnish the water supply of much of the Earth's present arid regions. 80 million years ago, great disturbances occurred in the Earth's crust. The western advance of the continental drift was coming to a standstill, and the enormous energy of the sluggish momentum of the intercontinental mass up-crumpled the Pacific shoreline of both North and South America, and initiated profound repercussional changes along the Pacific shores of Asia. This circum-Pacific land elevation, which culminated in present-day mountain ranges, is more than 25,000 miles long, and the upheavals attendant upon its birth were the greatest surface distortions to take place since life appeared on Urantia. The lava flows, both above and below ground, were extensive and widespread. 75 million years ago marks the end of the continental drift. From Alaska to Cape Horn, the long Pacific coast mountain ranges were completed, but there were as yet few peaks. The backthrust of the halted continental drift continued the elevation of the western plains of North America, while in the east the worn-down Appalachian mountains of the Atlantic coast region were projected straight up with little or no tilting. 70 million years ago, the crustal distortions connected with the maximum elevation of the Rocky Mountain region took place. A large segment of rock was overthrust 15 miles at the surface in British Columbia. Here, the Cambrian rocks are obliquely thrust out over the Cretaceous layers. On the eastern slope of the Rocky Mountains near the Canadian border, there was another spectacular overthrust. Here may be found the pre-life stone layers shoved out over the then recent Cretaceous deposits. This was an age of volcanic activity all over the world, giving rise to numerous small isolated volcanic cones. Submarine volcanoes broke out in the submerged Himalayan region. Much of the rest of Asia, including Siberia, was also still underwater. 65 million years ago, there occurred one of the greatest lava flows of all time. The deposition layers of these and preceding lava flows are to be found all over the Americas, North and South Africa, Australia, and parts of Europe. The land animals were little changed, but because of greater continental emergence, especially in North America, they rapidly multiplied. North America was the great field of the land animal evolution of these times, most of Europe being underwater. The climate was still warm and uniform. The Arctic regions were enjoying weather much like that of the present climate in central and southern North America. Great plant life evolution was taking place. Among the land plants, the angiosperms predominated, and many present-day trees first appeared, including beech, birch, oak, walnut, sycamore, maple, and modern palms. Fruits, grasses, and cereals were abundant, and these seed-bearing grasses and trees were to the plant world what the ancestors of man were to the animal world. They were second in evolutionary importance only to the appearance of man himself. Suddenly, and without previous gradation, the great family of flowering plants mutated, and this new flora soon overspread the entire world. 60 million years ago, though the land reptiles were on the decline, the dinosaurs continued as monarchs of the land, the lead now being taken by the more agile and active types of the smaller leaping kangaroo varieties of the carnivorous dinosaurs. But some time previously, there had appeared new types of the herbivorous dinosaurs, whose rapid increase was due to the appearance of the grass family of land plants. One of these new grass-eating dinosaurs was a true quadruped, having 2 horns and a cape-like shoulder flange. The land type of turtle, 20 feet across, appeared as did also the modern crocodile and true snakes of the modern type. Great changes were also occurring among the fishes and other forms of marine life. The wading and swimming pre-birds of earlier ages had not been a success in the air, nor had the flying dinosaurs. They were a short-lived species, soon becoming extinct. They, too, were subject to the dinosaur doom, destruction, because of having too little brain substance in comparison with body size. This second attempt to produce animals that could navigate the atmosphere failed, as did the abortive attempt to produce mammals during this and a preceding age. 55 million years ago, the evolutionary march was marked by the sudden appearance of the first of the true birds, a small, pigeon-like creature which was the ancestor of all bird life. This was the third type of flying creature to appear on Earth, and it sprang directly from the reptilian group, not from the contemporary flying dinosaurs, nor from the earlier types of toothed land birds. And so this becomes known as the Age of Birds, as well as the declining age of reptiles. The end of the Chalk period. The great Cretaceous period was drawing to a close, and its termination marks the end of the great sea invasions of the continents. Particularly is this true of North America, where there had been just 24 great inundations. And though there were subsequent minor submergences, none of these can be compared with the extensive and lengthy marine invasions of this and previous ages. These alternate periods of land and sea dominance have occurred in million-year cycles. There has been an age-long rhythm associated with this rise and fall of ocean floor and continental land levels, and these same rhythmical crustal movements will continue from this time on throughout the Earth's history, but with diminishing frequency and extent. This period also witnesses the end of the continental drift and the building of the modern mountains of Urantia. But the pressure of the continental masses and the thwarted momentum of their age-long drift are not the exclusive influences in mountain building. The chief and underlying factor in determining the location of a mountain range is the pre-existent lowland or trough, which has become filled up with the comparatively lighter deposits of the land erosion and marine drifts of the preceding ages. These lighter areas of land are sometimes 15,000 to 20,000 feet thick. Therefore, when the crust is subjected to pressure from any cause, these lighter areas are the first to crumple up, fold, and rise upward to afford compensatory adjustment for the contending and conflicting forces and pressures at work in the Earth's crust or underneath the crust. Sometimes these upthrusts of land occur without folding, but in connection with the rise of the Rocky Mountains, great folding and tilting occurred, coupled with enormous overthrusts of the various layers, both underground and at the surface. The oldest mountains of the world are located in Asia, Greenland, and northern Europe, among those of the older east-west systems. The mid-age mountains are in the Circum-Pacific group, and in the second European east-west system, which was born at about the same time. This gigantic uprising is almost 10,000 miles long, extending from Europe over into the West Indies land elevations. The youngest mountains are in the Rocky Mountain system, where for ages land elevations had occurred only to be successively covered by the sea, though some of the higher lands remained as islands. Subsequent to the formation of the mid-age mountains, a real mountain highland was elevated which was destined, subsequently, to be carved into the present Rocky Mountains by the combined artistry of nature's elements. The present North American Rocky Mountain region is not the original elevation of land. That elevation had been long since leveled by erosion and then re-elevated. The present Front Range of mountains is what is left of the remains of the original range, which was re-elevated. Pikes Peak and Long's Peak are outstanding examples of this mountain activity, extending over 2 or more generations of mountain lives. These 2 peaks held their heads above water during several of the preceding inundations. Biologically, as well as geologically, this was an eventful and active age, on land and underwater. Sea urchins increased while corals and crinoids decreased. The ammonites of preponderant influence during a previous age also rapidly declined. On land, the fern forests were largely replaced by pine and other modern trees, including the gigantic redwoods. By the end of this period, while the placental mammal has not yet evolved, the biologic stage is fully set for the appearance, in a subsequent age, of the early ancestors of the future mammalian types. And thus ends a long era of world evolution, extending from the early appearance of land life down to the more recent times of the immediate ancestors of the human species and its collateral branches. This, the Cretaceous Age, covers 50 million years and brings to a close the pre-mammalian era of land life, which extends over a period of 100 million years and is known as the Mesozoic. The Mammalian Era on Urantia. The era of mammals extends from the times of the origin of placental mammals to the end of the Ice Age, covering a little less than 50 million years. During this Cenozoic age, the world's landscape presented an attractive appearance: rolling hills, broad valleys, wide rivers, and great forests. Twice during this sector of time, the Panama Isthmus went up and down. 3 times Bering Strait land bridge did the same. The animal types were both many and varied. The trees swarmed with birds, and the whole world was an animal paradise, notwithstanding the incessant struggle of the evolving animal species for supremacy. The accumulated deposits of the 5 periods of this 50 million year era contain the fossil records of the successive mammalian dynasties and lead right up through the times of the actual appearance of man himself. The new continental land stage, the age of early mammals. 50 million years ago, the land areas of the world were very generally above water, or only slightly submerged. The formations and deposits of this period are both land and marine, but chiefly land. For a considerable time the land gradually rose, but was simultaneously washed down to the lower levels and toward the seas. Early in this period, and in North America, the placental type of mammals suddenly appeared, and they constituted the most important evolutionary development up to this time. Previous orders of non-placental mammals had existed, but this new type sprang directly and suddenly from the pre-existent reptilian ancestor whose descendants had persisted on down through the times of dinosaur decline. The father of the placental mammals was a small, highly active, carnivorous, springing type of dinosaur. Basic mammalian instincts began to be manifested in these primitive mammalian types. Mammals possess an immense survival advantage over all other forms of animal life in that they can 1. Bring forth relatively mature and well-developed offspring, 2. Nourish, nurture, and protect their offspring with affectionate regard, 3. Employ their superior brain power in self-perpetuation, 4. Utilize increased agility in escaping from enemies, 5. Apply superior intelligence to environmental adjustment and adaptation. 45 million years ago, the continental backbones were elevated in association with a very general sinking of the coastlines. Mammalian life was evolving rapidly. A small reptilian, egg-laying type of mammal flourished, and the ancestors of the later kangaroos roamed Australia. Soon there were small horses, fleet-footed rhinoceroses, tapirs with proboscises, primitive pigs, squirrels, lemurs, opossums, and several tribes of monkey-like animals. They were all small, primitive, and best suited to living among the forests of the mountain regions. A large ostrich-like land bird developed to a height of 10 feet and laid an egg 9 by 13 inches. These were the ancestors of the later gigantic passenger birds that were so highly intelligent and that one time transported human beings through the air. The mammals of the early Cenozoic lived on land, under the water, in the air, and among the treetops. They had from 1 to 11 pairs of mammary glands, and all were covered with considerable hair. In common with the later appearing orders, they developed 2 successive sets of teeth, and possessed large brains in comparison to body size. But among them all, no modern forms existed. 40 million years ago, the land areas of the northern hemisphere began to elevate, and this was followed by new extensive land deposits and other terrestrial activities, including lava flows, warping, lake formation, and erosion. During the latter part of this epoch, most of Europe was submerged. Following a slight land rise, the continent was covered by lakes and bays. The Arctic Ocean, through the Ural Depression, ran south to connect with the Mediterranean Sea as it was then expanded northward, the highlands of the Alps, Carpathians, Apennines, and Pyrenees being up above the water as islands of the sea. The Isthmus of Panama was up. The Atlantic and Pacific Oceans were separated. North America was connected with Asia by the Bering Strait land bridge, and with Europe by way of Greenland and Iceland. The Earth's circuit of land in northern latitudes was broken only by the Ural Straits, which connected the Arctic seas with the enlarged Mediterranean. Considerable foraminiferal limestone was deposited in European waters. Today, this same stone is elevated to a height of 10,000 feet in the Alps, 16,000 feet in the Himalayas, and 20,000 feet in Tibet. The chalk deposits of this period are found along the coasts of Africa and Australia, on the west coast of South America, and about the West Indies. Throughout this so-called Eocene period, the evolution of mammalian and other related forms of life continued with little or no interruption. North America was then connected by land with every continent except Australia, and the world was gradually overrun by primitive mammalian fauna of various types. The recent flood stage, the age of advanced mammals. This period was characterized by the further and rapid evolution of placental mammals, the more progressive forms of mammalian life developing during these times. Although the early placental mammals sprang from carnivorous ancestors, very soon herbivorous branches developed, and ere long omnivorous mammalian families also sprang up. The angiosperms were the principal food of the rapidly increasing mammals, the modern land flora, including the majority of present-day plants and trees, having appeared during earlier periods. 35 million years ago marks the beginning of the age of placental mammalian world domination. The southern land bridge was extensive, reconnecting the then enormous Antarctic continent with South America, South Africa, and Australia. In spite of the massing of land in high latitudes, the world climate remained relatively mild because of the enormous increase in the size of the tropic seas, nor was the land elevated sufficiently to produce glaciers. Extensive lava flows occurred in Greenland and Iceland, some coal being deposited between these layers. Marked changes were taking place in the fauna of the planet. The sea life was undergoing great modification. Most of the present-day orders of marine life were in existence, and foraminifers continued to play an important role. The insect life was much like that of the previous era. The florissant fossil beds of Colorado belong to the later years of these far distant times. Most of the living insect families go back to this period, but many then in existence are now extinct, though their fossils remain. On land, this was preeminently the age of mammalian renovation and expansion. Of the earlier and more primitive mammals, over 100 species were extinct before this period ended. Even the mammals of large size and small brain soon perished. Brains and agility had replaced armor and size in the progress of animal survival. And with the dinosaur family on the decline, the mammals slowly assumed domination of the earth, speedily and completely destroying the remainder of their reptilian ancestors. Along with the disappearance of the dinosaurs, other and great changes occurred in the various branches of the saurian family. The surviving members of the early reptilian families are turtles, snakes, and crocodiles, together with the venerable frog, the only remaining group representative of man's earlier ancestors. Various groups of mammals had their origin in a unique animal now extinct. This carnivorous creature was something of a cross between a cat and a seal. It could live on land or in water, and was highly intelligent and very active. In Europe, the ancestor of the canine family evolved, soon giving rise to many species of small dogs. About the same time, the gnawing rodents, including beavers, squirrels, gophers, mice, and rabbits, appeared, and soon became a notable form of life, very little change having since occurred in this family. The later deposits of this period contain the fossil remains of dogs, cats, coons, and weasels in ancestral form. 30 million years ago, the modern types of mammals began to make their appearance. Formerly, the mammals had lived for the greater part in the hills, being of the mountainous types. Suddenly, there began the evolution of the plains or hoofed type, the grazing species, as differentiated from the clawed flesh-eaters. These grazers sprang from an undifferentiated ancestor having 5 toes and 44 teeth, which perished before the end of the age. Toe evolution did not progress beyond the 3-toed stage throughout this period. The horse, an outstanding example of evolution, lived during these times in both North America and Europe, though his development was not fully completed until the later Ice Age. While the rhinoceros family appeared at the close of this period, it underwent its greatest expansion subsequently. A small hog-like creature also developed, which became the ancestor of the many species of swine, peccaries, and hippopotamuses. Camels and llamas had their origin in North America about the middle of this period, and overran the western plains. Later, the llamas migrated to South America, the camels to Europe, and soon both were extinct in North America, though a few camels survived up to the Ice Age. About this time, a notable thing occurred in western North America. The early ancestors of the ancient lemurs first made their appearance. While this family cannot be regarded as true lemurs, their coming marked the establishment of the line from which the true lemurs subsequently sprang. Like the land serpents of a previous age, which betook themselves to the seas, now a whole tribe of placental mammals deserted the land and took up their residence in the oceans. and they have ever since remained in the sea, yielding the modern whales, dolphins, porpoises, seals, and sea lions. The bird life of the planet continued to develop, but with few important evolutionary changes. The majority of modern birds were existent, including gulls, herons, flamingos, buzzards, falcons, eagles, owls, quails, and ostriches. By the close of this Oligocene period, covering 10 million years, the plant life, together with the marine life and the land animals, had very largely evolved, and was present on Earth much as today. Considerable specialization has subsequently appeared, but the ancestral forms of most living things were then alive. The modern mountain stage, age of the elephant and the horse. Land elevation and sea segregation were slowly changing the world's weather, gradually cooling it, but the climate was still mild. Sequoias and magnolias grew in Greenland, but the subtropical plants were beginning to migrate southward. By the end of this period, these warm climate plants and trees had largely disappeared from the northern latitudes, their places being taken by more hardy plants and the deciduous trees. There was a great increase in the varieties of grasses, and the teeth of many mammalian species gradually altered to conform to the present-day grazing type. 25 million years ago, there was a slight land submergence following the long epoch of land elevation. The Rocky Mountain region remained highly elevated, so that the deposition of erosion material continued throughout the lowlands to the east. The Sierras were well re-elevated. In fact, they have been rising ever since. The great 4-mile vertical fault in the California region dates from this time. 20 million years ago was indeed the golden age of mammals. Bering Strait land bridge was up, and many groups of animals migrated to North America from Asia, including the 4-tusked mastodons, short-legged rhinoceroses, and many varieties of the cat family. The first deer appeared, and North America was soon overrun by ruminants, deer, oxen, camels, bison, and several species of rhinoceroses, but the giant pigs, more than 6 feet tall, became extinct. The huge elephants of this and subsequent periods possessed large brains as well as large bodies, and they soon overran the entire world except Australia. For once, the world was dominated by a huge animal with a brain sufficiently large to enable it to carry on. Confronted by the highly intelligent life of these ages, no animal the size of an elephant could have survived unless it had possessed a brain of large size and superior quality. In intelligence and adaptation, the elephant is approached only by the horse, and is surpassed only by man himself. Even so, of the 50 species of elephants in existence at the opening of this period, only 2 have survived. 15 million years ago, the mountain regions of Eurasia were rising, and there was some volcanic activity throughout these regions, but nothing comparable to the lava flows of the Western Hemisphere. These unsettled conditions prevailed all over the world. The Strait of Gibraltar closed, and Spain was connected with Africa by the old land bridge, but the Mediterranean flowed into the Atlantic through a narrow channel which extended across France, the mountain peaks and highlands appearing as islands above this ancient sea. Later on, these European seas began to withdraw. Still later, the Mediterranean was connected with the Indian Ocean, while at the close of this period the Suez region was elevated so that the Mediterranean became, for a time, an inland salt sea. The Iceland land bridge submerged, and the Arctic waters commingled with those of the Atlantic Ocean. The Atlantic coast of North America rapidly cooled, but the Pacific coast remained warmer than at present. The great ocean currents were in function, and affected climate much as they do today. Mammalian life continued to evolve. Enormous herds of horses joined the camels on the western plains of North America. This was truly the age of horses, as well as of elephants. The horse's brain is next in animal quality to that of the elephant, but in one respect it is decidedly inferior, for the horse never fully overcame the deep-seated propensity to flee when frightened. The horse lacks the emotional control of the elephant, while the elephant is greatly handicapped by size and lack of agility. During this period, an animal evolved which was somewhat like both the elephant and the horse, but it was soon destroyed by the rapidly increasing cat family. As Urantia is entering the so-called horseless age, you should pause and ponder what this animal meant to your ancestors. Men first used horses for food, then for travel, and later in agriculture and war. The horse has long served mankind and has played an important part in the development of human civilization. The biologic developments of this period contributed much toward the setting of the stage for the subsequent appearance of man. In Central Asia, the true types of both the primitive monkey and the gorilla evolved, having a common ancestor, now extinct. But neither of these species is concerned in the line of living beings which were, later on, to become the ancestors of the human race. The dog family was represented by several groups, notably wolves and foxes, the cat tribe by panthers and large saber-toothed tigers, the latter first evolving in North America. The modern cat and dog families increased in numbers all over the world. Weasels, martens, otters, and raccoons thrived and developed throughout the northern latitudes. Birds continued to evolve, though few marked changes occurred. Reptiles were similar to modern types, snakes, crocodiles, and turtles. Thus drew to a close a very eventful and interesting period of the world's history. This age of the elephant and the horse is known as the Miocene. The recent continental elevation stage, the last great mammalian migration.
This is the period of pre-glacial land elevation in North America, Europe, and Asia. The land was greatly altered in topography. Mountain ranges were born, streams changed their courses, and isolated volcanoes broke out all over the world.
10 million years ago began an age of widespread local land deposits on the lowlands of the continents, but most of these sedimentations were later removed. Much of Europe at this time was still underwater, including parts of England, Belgium, and France, and the Mediterranean Sea covered much of northern Africa. In North America, extensive depositions were made at the mountain bases, in lakes, and in the great land basins. These deposits average only about 200 feet, are more or less colored, and fossils are rare. Two great freshwater lakes existed in western North America. The Sierras were elevating. Shasta, Hood, and Rainier were beginning their mountain careers. But it was not until the subsequent Ice Age that North America began its creep toward the Atlantic Depression. For a short time, all the land of the world was again joined, excepting Australia, and the last great worldwide animal migration took place. North America was connected with both South America and Asia, and there was a free exchange of animal life. Asiatic sloths, armadillos, antelopes, and bears entered North America, while North American camels went to China. Rhinoceroses migrated over the whole world except Australia and South America, but they were extinct in the Western Hemisphere by the close of this period. In general, the life of the preceding period continued to evolve and spread. The cat family dominated the animal life, and marine life was almost at a standstill. Many of the horses were still three-toed, but the modern types were arriving. Llamas and giraffe-like camels mingled with the horses on the grazing plains. The giraffe appeared in Africa, having just as long a neck then as now. In South America, sloths, armadillos, anteaters, and the South American type of primitive monkeys evolved. Before the continents were finally isolated, those massive animals, the mastodons, migrated everywhere except to Australia. 5 million years ago, the horse evolved as it now is, and from North America migrated to all the world. But the horse had become extinct on the continent of its origin long before the red man arrived. The climate was gradually getting cooler. The land plants were slowly moving southward. At first it was the increasing cold in the north that stopped animal migrations over the northern isthmuses. Subsequently these North American land bridges went down. Soon afterwards, the land connection between Africa and South America finally submerged, and the Western Hemisphere was isolated, much as it is today. From this time forward, distinct types of life began to develop in the Eastern and Western Hemispheres. And thus does this period of almost 10 million years' duration draw to a close, and not yet has the ancestor of man appeared. This is the time usually designated as the Pliocene. The Early Ice Age. By the close of the preceding period, the lands of the northeastern part of North America and of northern Europe were highly elevated on an extensive scale. In North America, vast areas rising up to 30,000 feet and more. Mild climates had formerly prevailed over these northern regions, and the Arctic waters were all open to evaporation, and they continued to be ice-free until almost the close of the glacial period. Simultaneously with these land elevations, the ocean currents shifted, and the seasonal winds changed their direction. These conditions eventually produced an almost constant precipitation of moisture from the movement of the heavily saturated atmosphere over the northern highlands. Snow began to fall on these elevated and therefore cool regions, and it continued to fall until it had attained a depth of 20,000 feet. The areas of the greatest depth of snow, together with altitude, determined the central points of subsequent glacial pressure flows. And the Ice Age persisted just as long as this excessive precipitation continued to cover these northern highlands with this enormous mantle of snow, which soon metamorphosed into solid but creeping ice. The great ice sheets of this period were all located on elevated highlands, not in mountainous regions where they are found today. 1/2 of the glacial ice was in North America, 1/4 in Eurasia, and 1/4 elsewhere, chiefly in Antarctica. Africa was little affected by the ice, but Australia was almost covered with the Antarctic ice blanket. The northern regions of this world have experienced 6 separate and distinct ice invasions, although there were scores of advances and recessions associated with the activity of each individual ice sheet. The ice in North America collected in 2 and later 3 centers. Greenland was covered, and Iceland was completely buried beneath the ice floe. In Europe, the ice at various times covered the British Isles, excepting the coast of southern England, and it overspread Western Europe down to France. 2 million years ago, the first North American glacier started its southern advance. The Ice Age was now in the making, and this glacier consumed nearly 1 million years in its advance from and retreat back toward the northern pressure centers. The central ice sheet extended south as far as Kansas. The eastern and western ice centers were not then so extensive. 1,500,000 years ago, the first great glacier was retreating northward. In the meantime, enormous quantities of snow had been falling on Greenland and on the northeastern part of North America, and ere long this eastern ice mass began to flow southward. This was the second invasion of the ice. These first 2 ice invasions were not extensive in Eurasia. During these early epochs of the Ice Age, North America was overrun with mastodons, woolly mammoths, horses, camels, deer, musk oxen, bison, ground sloths, giant beavers, saber-toothed tigers, sloths as large as elephants, and many groups of the cat and dog families. But from this time forward, they were rapidly reduced in numbers by the increasing cold of the glacial period. Toward the close of the Ice Age, the majority of these animal species were extinct in North America. Away from the ice, the land and water life of the world was little changed. Between the ice invasions, the climate was about as mild as at present, perhaps a little warmer. The glaciers were, after all, local phenomena, though they spread out to cover enormous areas. The coastwise climate varied greatly between the times of glacial inaction and those times when enormous icebergs were sliding off the coast of Maine into the Atlantic, slipping out through Puget Sound into the Pacific, and thundering down Norwegian fjords into the North Sea. Primitive Man in the Ice Age. The great event of this glacial period was the evolution of primitive man. Slightly to the west of India, on land now underwater and among the offspring of Asiatic migrants of the older North American lemur types, the dawn mammals suddenly appeared. These small animals walked mostly on their hind legs, and they possessed large brains in proportion to their size and in comparison with the brains of other animals. In the 70th generation of this order of life, a new and higher group of animals suddenly differentiated. These new mid-mammals, almost twice the size and height of their ancestors and possessing proportionately increased brain power, had only well established themselves when the primates, the third vital mutation, suddenly appeared. At this same time, a retrograde development within the mid-mammal stock gave origin to the simian ancestry, and from that day to this, the human branch has gone forward by progressive evolution, while the simian tribes have remained stationary or have actually retrogressed. 1 million years ago, Urantia was registered as an inhabited world. A mutation within the stock of the progressing primates suddenly produced two primitive human beings, the actual ancestors of mankind. This event occurred at about the time of the beginning of the third glacial advance. Thus it may be seen that your early ancestors were born and bred in a stimulating, invigorating, and difficult environment, and the sole survivors of these Urantia aborigines, the Eskimos, even now prefer to dwell in frigid northern climes. Human beings were not present in the Western Hemisphere until near the close of the Ice Age, but during the interglacial epochs they passed westward around the Mediterranean and soon overran the continent of Europe. In the caves of Western Europe may be found human bones mingled with the remains of both tropic and Arctic animals, testifying that man lived in these regions throughout the later epochs of the advancing and retreating glaciers. The continuing Ice Age. Throughout the glacial period, other activities were in progress, but the action of the ice overshadows all other phenomena in the northern latitudes. No other terrestrial activity leaves such characteristic evidence on the topography. The distinctive boulders and surface cleavages, such as potholes, lakes, displaced stone, and rock flour, are to be found in connection with no other phenomenon in nature. The ice is also responsible for those gentle swells or surface undulations known as drumlins, and a glacier, as it advances, displaces rivers and changes the whole face of the earth. Glaciers alone leave behind them those telltale drifts, the ground, lateral, and terminal moraines. These drifts, particularly the ground moraines, extend from the eastern seaboard north and westward in North America, and are found in Europe and Siberia. 750,000 years ago, the fourth ice sheet, a union of the North American central and eastern ice fields, was well on its way south. At its height it reached to southern Illinois, displacing the Mississippi River 50 miles to the west, and in the east it extended as far south as the Ohio River and central Pennsylvania. In Asia, the Siberian ice sheet made its southernmost invasion, while in Europe the advancing ice stopped just short of the mountain barrier of the Alps. 500,000 years ago, during the fifth advance of the ice, a new development accelerated the course of human evolution. Suddenly, and in one generation, the 6 colored races mutated from the aboriginal human stock. This is a doubly important date, since it also marks the arrival of the planetary prince. In North America, the advancing fifth glacier consisted of a combined invasion by all 3 ice centers. The eastern lobe, however, extended only a short distance below the St. Lawrence Valley, and the western ice sheet made little southern advance. But the central lobe reached south to cover most of the state of Iowa. In Europe, this invasion of the ice was not so extensive as the preceding one. 250,000 years ago, the 6th and last glaciation began. and despite the fact that the northern highlands had begun to sink slightly, this was the period of greatest snow deposition on the northern ice fields. In this invasion, the three great ice sheets coalesced into one vast ice mass, and all of the western mountains participated in this glacial activity. This was the largest of all ice invasions in North America. The ice moved south over 1,500 miles from its pressure centers, and North America experienced its lowest temperatures. 200,000 years ago, during the advance of the last glacier, there occurred an episode which had much to do with the march of events on Urantia, the Lucifer Rebellion. 150,000 years ago, the sixth and last glacier reached its farthest points of southern extension, the western ice sheet crossing just over the Canadian border, the central coming down into Kansas, Missouri, and Illinois, the eastern sheet advancing south and covering the greater portion of Pennsylvania and Ohio. This is the glacier that sent forth the many tongues or ice lobes which carved out the present-day lakes, great and small. During its retreat, the North American system of Great Lakes was produced, and Urantia geologists have very accurately deduced the various stages of this development and have correctly surmised that these bodies of water did, at different times, empty first into the Mississippi Valley, then eastward into the Hudson Valley, and finally, by a northern route, into the St. Lawrence. It is 37,000 years since the connected Great Lakes system began to empty out over the present Niagara route. 100,000 years ago, during the retreat of the last glacier, the vast polar ice sheets began to form, and the center of ice accumulation moved considerably northward. And as long as the polar regions continue to be covered with ice, it is hardly possible for another glacial age to occur, regardless of future land elevations or modification of ocean currents. This last glacier was 100,000 years advancing, and it required a like span of time to complete its northern retreat. The temperate regions have been free from the ice for a little over 50,000 years. The rigorous glacial period destroyed many species, and radically changed numerous others. Many were sorely sifted by the to and fro migration which was made necessary by the advancing and retreating ice. Those animals which followed the glaciers back and forth over the land were the bear, bison, reindeer, musk ox, mammoth, and mastodon. The mammoth sought the open prairies, but the mastodon preferred the sheltered fringes of the forest regions. The mammoth, until a late date, ranged from Mexico to Canada. The Siberian variety became wool-covered. The mastodon persisted in North America until exterminated by the red man, much as the white man later killed off the bison. In North America, during the last glaciation, the horse, tapir, llama, and saber-toothed tiger became extinct. In their places, sloths, armadillos, and water hogs came up from South America. The enforced migration of life before the advancing ice led to an extraordinary commingling of plants and of animals, and with the retreat of the final ice invasion, many Arctic species of both plants and animals were left stranded high upon certain mountain peaks, whither they had journeyed to escape destruction by the glacier. And so, today, these dislocated plants and animals may be found high up on the Alps of Europe and even on the Appalachian Mountains of North America. The Ice Age is the last completed geologic period, the so-called Pleistocene, over 2 million years in length. 35,000 years ago marks the termination of the Great Ice Age, excepting in the polar regions of the planet. This date is also significant in that it approximates the arrival of a material son and daughter, and the beginning of the Adamic dispensation, roughly corresponding to the beginning of the Holocene or post-glacial period. This narrative, extending from the rise of mammalian life to the retreat of the ice and on down to historic times, covers a span of almost 50 million years. This is the last, the current, geologic period, and is known to your researchers as the Cenozoic or recent times era.
And the cat's in the cradle and the silver spoon, little boy blue and the man in the moon. When you're coming home, Dad, I don't know when, but we'll get together then, yeah. We're gonna gonna have a good time there.